Brittany Miller was worried when she didn't hear from her next-door neighbor Mrs. Olsen for several days, so she called the cops and informed them of the situation. The cops were stunned when they broke open Mrs. Olsen's house door and found her lying unconscious with a baby inside. Hello, 911? Yes, ma'am, how can we help? This is Brittany Miller. I'm calling to inform you about my neighbor, Mrs. Jane Olsen. I haven't heard from her for days and I'm worried about her. What's her address, ma'am, and when did you last hear from her? She left her home this week on Monday saying she was going to attend her daughter and son-in-law's funeral. She called me that evening saying she'd be back soon, but I called her several times after that and she didn't return my calls. It's been 2 days. I'm out of town now, so I have no way of checking up on her at home, but I'm worried because she didn't have any family other than her daughter and she must be alone with her granddaughter right now. The dispatcher immediately sent a unit to the location. By chance, the unit closest to the address was manned by officers Andrew Banks and Dave Stanfield. The dispatcher explained that an elderly woman had gone to a funeral and had not returned. Within minutes, the 2 officers were headed to the address. What do you think happened? Dave asked Andrew as they were on their way to Mrs. Olsen's house. Well, we'll find out once we find her, but what did her next-door neighbor say? Turns out her daughter and son-in-law were killed in a plane crash in Mexico. They had a 1-year-old daughter who was at the time staying with her grandmother. I think we should also pay Brittany Miller a visit, Andrew suggested. She can provide us with additional information. She appears to be close to Mrs. Olsen. Yeah, you're right. She said she was on vacation with her family but will return this evening. Meanwhile, let's see if Mrs. Olsen is at home. When the officers arrived, they walked up to Mrs. Olsen's house and rang the doorbell, but no one answered. The cops were about to leave the house thinking the old lady wasn't inside when they heard a baby crying. Concerned, the officers broke open the door and discovered Mrs. Olsen unconscious inside. Thankfully, she was still alive. Dave immediately summoned an ambulance for the elderly lady. Andrew, on the other hand, tracked the crying sound and discovered a baby in a cradle. As he held the little baby in his arms, he noticed a pungent odor indicating the little girl's diaper needed to be changed. He looked around the room for diapers and saw a packet on the table. He changed the baby's diaper quickly, but she wouldn't stop crying. When the ambulance arrived, the officers were concerned, so they accompanied Mrs. Olsen and the child to the hospital. Mrs. Olsen was admitted to the intensive care unit while a nurse examined the baby. The officers were later informed that the baby was fine. She was simply starving, which was why she wouldn't stop crying. Andrew held the baby girl in his arms and stayed with her the entire time. Meanwhile, a doctor informed Dave that Mrs. Olsen had an emotional breakdown and suffered a stroke as a result. When Mrs. Olsen woke up, Dave and Andrew were already by her bedside. Are you feeling any better, ma'am? Dave inquired, slowly helping her get up. Yes, officer, Mrs. Olsen spoke in a trembling voice. But how did I get here? I remember I was about to prepare milk for my granddaughter, and after that I don't remember anything. It turns out you had a stroke, ma'am. You should thank your next-door neighbor Brittany Miller for informing us about you. Why didn't you respond to her calls? Oh, I'm sorry. I misplaced my phone the day after I arrived from Mexico. I later purchased a new one, but I couldn't recall Brittany's phone number. Where's my granddaughter? Don't be concerned, she's safe. We handed her over to a nurse and she's currently sleeping peacefully. But ma'am, we'll have to keep her with us until the court determines whether you're fit to raise her alone. I see, Mrs. Olsen said, her voice sad. However, I wish the court would rule in my favor. She's the only one I've got right now. Don't worry, ma'am, we'll try our best to see that happen. Get well soon, Andrew and Dave assured her. But a week later, the court decided the baby be placed in an orphanage because Mrs. Olsen was unfit to care for her. Mrs. Olsen was devastated by the situation, to say the least. Andrew and Dave paid her daily visits and they could see the anguish in her eyes after she was separated from her granddaughter. In the end, Andrew and his wife decided to adopt the baby. They paid a visit to Mrs. Olsen on the day the adoption was finalized, and the elderly woman couldn't believe her eyes when she saw little Lily on her doorstep. Later, the couple asked Mrs. Olsen to move in with them and she gladly agreed. Meanwhile, Dave paid frequent visits to Andrew's home and the 3 of them had a great time together. When Mrs. Olsen died 10 years later, she left her entire estate to the 2 officers who'd helped her, but Dave gave his portion to Andrew's family, explaining that he deserved it because he literally appeared as an angel in Mrs. Olsen's life and saved her from despair. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider sharing it with someone who may find it interesting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.